This is BBC1. Now the 9 o'clock news with Peter Sissons.
Rosemary West, accused of 10 murders, goes into the witness box to plead her innocence. She tells of falling for the lies of Frederick West and the locked cellar from which she was barred. Good evening. Rosemary West, on trial at Winchester, accused of 10 murders, today became the first witness called in her own defence. Her counsel told the court she knew nothing about and took no part in any of the killings. In her evidence, she described how as a vulnerable teenager she'd fallen for the lies of Frederick West, but they'd ended up leading separate lives. Shown photographs of some of the victims, she said she'd never seen any of them. And the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester was somewhere Frederick West often worked but forbade her to enter. Frederick West committed suicide in jail 10 months ago.
Rosemary West made her all-too-familiar journey to court again this morning. But today, for the first time, she was to speak directly to the jury. Shown photographs of 5 of the women she's accused of killing, Mrs. West said she'd never seen them before. First, though, her counsel, Richard Ferguson QC, had some blunt words for the jury, now down to 11 people after one juror was discharged for reasons not explained in court. Mr. Ferguson said, "I want to tell you as loudly and as clearly as I can that Rosemary West is not guilty of any of the counts on this indictment. She neither knew of nor participated in any of the acts which led to the deaths of these girls. Nor did she knowingly hide or conceal these murders." Counsel suggested to the jury that Frederick West was responsible for the killings. He suggested that before Mr. West had even met Rosemary, he'd murdered his first wife, Rena, as well as Anne McFall, a woman who'd helped look after his children. Mr. Ferguson then turned to the 10 victims his client is accused of murdering. He said there was no evidence of how they met their deaths. Because there could be no evidence, the Crown had filled that void with prejudice and speculation. Mr. Ferguson said the prosecution had claimed that because Rosemary West lived in the same house as her husband, she must have known what was going on. But he said, the fact that Rosemary West may be a lesbian does not make her a murderer. The fact that Rosemary West had sex with some of the lodgers does not make her a murderer. The fact that she was forced into prostitution does not make her a murderer. Then it was the turn of Rosemary West to walk the short distance from the dock into the witness box. In a soft, nervous voice, she began her evidence by saying she'd had her first sexual relationship at about the age of 14. She'd been raped twice by strangers and abandoned by her mother. She said that Frederick West had promised to love and care for her. Because she was so young, she'd fallen for his lies. 2.5 weeks ago, the family's former nanny, Caroline Owens, glimpsed here on her way into court, said she'd been abducted and assaulted by the Wests in 1972. Rosemary and Frederick West admitted indecent assault and causing actual bodily harm. Each was fined £50. Asked about the incident today, Rosemary West said she didn't remember her time in court at all. She said she knew in some ways she'd done wrong. "I made a mistake," she said. Asked what the mistake had been, she said, "My memory is almost non-existent." She was then asked about the disappearance of her stepdaughter Charmaine, her first alleged victim. Rosemary West said Charmaine's mother had come to the family's home in Gloucester to pick up her little girl. Mrs. West saw her but didn't speak to her. She said Frederick West had been released from prison before Charmaine disappeared. Before leaving court, Rosemary West said she and her husband literally led separate lives. He did what he wanted to do, she said. Mrs. West will be cross-examined by the prosecution tomorrow. Joshua Rosenberg, BBC News, Winchester.